Sleep teaching was actually prohibited in England. There was something called liberalism. Parliament, if you know what that was, passed a law against it. The records survive. Speeches about liberty of the subject, liberty to be inefficient and miserable, freedom to be a round peg in a square hole. But my dear chap, you're welcome. I assure you, you're welcome. Henry Foster patted the assistant predestinator on the shoulder. Everyone belongs to everyone else, after all. 100 repetitions, 3 nights a week for 4 years, thought Bernard Marx, who was a specialist in hypnopedia. 62,400 repetitions make one truth. Idiots. Or the caste system, constantly proposed, constantly rejected. There was something called democracy, as though men were more than physico chemically equal. Well, all I can say is that I'm going to accept his invitation. Bernard hated them. Hated them. But they were two. They were large. They were strong. The 9 Years' War began in AF 141. Not even if it were true about the alcohol in his blood, surrogate. Phosgene, chloropicrin, ethyl indoacetate, diphenyl cyanide, diphenyl cyanuracil, trichloromethyl, chloroformate, dichlorophyll, sulfide, not to mention hydrocyanic acid, which I simply don't believe, Lenina concluded. The noise of 14,000 aeroplanes advanced in open order. But in the Kurfürstendamm and the 8th Arrondissement, the explosion of the anthrax bombs to hardly louder than the popping of a paper bag, because I do want to see a savage reservation. 2 of chlorine, 6 of carbon, 2 of hydrogen, 3 of nitrous dioxide or trioxide, plus mercury, and 2 of chlorine nitrous oxide equals, well, what? An enormous hole in the ground, a pile of masonry, some bits of flesh and mucus, a foot, with the boot still on it, flying through the air and landing flop in the middle of the geraniums, the scarlet ones. Such a splendid show that summer. You're hopeless, Lenina. I give you up. The Russian technique for infecting water supplies was particularly ingenious. Back turned to back. Fanny and Lenina continued their changing in silence. The 9 Years' War, the great economic collapse, there was a choice between world control and destruction, between stability and Fanny Crown's a nice girl too, said the assistant predestinator. In the nurseries, the elementary class consciousness lesson was over. The voices were adapting future demand to future industrial supply. I do love flying, they whispered. I do love flying. I do love having new clothes. I do love. Liberalism, of course, was dead of anthrax. But all the same, you couldn't do things by force. Not nearly so pneumatic as Lenina. Oh, not nearly. But old clothes are beastly, continued the untiring whisper. We always throw away old clothes. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better. Governments, an affair of sitting, not hitting. You rule with the brains and the buttocks, never with the fists. For example, there was the conscription of consumption. There, I'm ready, said Lenina, but Fanny remained speechless and averted. Let's make peace, Fanny, darling. Every man, woman, and child compelled to consume so much a year in the interests of industry, the sole result, ending, is better than mending. The more stitches, the less riches. The more stitches. One of these days, said Fanny with dismal emphasis, you'll get into trouble. Conscientiousness, objection, conscientious objection on an enormous scale. Anything not to consume, back to nature. I do love flying. I do love flying. Back to culture. Yes, actually to culture. You can't consume much if you sit still and read books. Do I look all right? Lenina asked. Her jacket was made of bottle green acetate cloth with green viscous fur at the cuffs and collar. 800 simple lifers were mowed down by machine guns at Golden Greens. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better than mending. Green corduroy shorts and white viscous woolen stockings turned down below the knee. There came the famous British Museum massacre. 2,000 culture fans gassed with dichloroethyl sulfide. A green and white jockey cap shaded Lenina's eyes. Her shoes were bright green and highly polished. In the end, said Mustafa Mond, the controllers realized that force was no good. The slower but infinitely surer methods of ectogenesis, neo-Pavlovian conditioning, and hypnopedia, and round her waist she wore a silver-mounted green Morocco surrogate cartridge belt, bulging, for Lenina was not a free martin, with the regulation supply of contraceptives. The discoveries of Pfister and Kawaguchi were at last made use of, an intensive propaganda against viviparous reproduction. Perfect! Cried Fanny enthusiastically. She could never resist Lenina's charm for long. And what a perfectly sweet Malthusian belt! Accompanied by a campaign against the past, by the closing of museums, the blowing up of historical monuments. Luckily, most of them had already been destroyed during the 9 Years' Wars, by the suppression of all books published before AF 150. I simply must get one like it, said Fanny. There were some things called the pyramids, for example. My old black patent bandolier and a man called Shakespeare. You've never heard of them, of course. It's an absolute disgrace, that bandolier of mine. Such are the advantages of a really scientific education. The more stitches, the less riches. The more stitches, the less